So
Okay.
it is my pleasure to introduce Guy Kirwan. Guy is an authority on the world's birds and is prolific bird life history author. Guy worked on 2 print volumes of the Handbook of Birds of the World, and he's updated or written more than 3,300 species accounts for HBW Alive. He produced some of the first texts for neotropical birds, and he's written papers, monographs, field guides, and other bird books. He currently serves as an associate editor for Birds of the World, where he updates and revises species accounts, and he maintains other professional associations with natural history museums. So welcome, Guy. Again, thank you for being here. Would you do us the favor of telling us a little bit about yourself and what kind of projects you've been working on the last decade or so, and kind of what drove you to researching the Kinglet Calyptura?
Yeah, sure. Well, the last 10 years have been very busy with first HBW Alive and now Birds of the World. But in between times, I have been doing a lot of research in museums rather than the field. The previous decade, I spent most of that decade in Brazil and the rest of South America birding, and now I'm kind of doing all the background work in museums to some of the things that caught my eye in the museum, in the field. This talk, as I will explain, comes from 3 strands of things that came together into a rather fortuitous instance that a colleague of mine in Switzerland found a new specimen of Calyptura, which was quite interesting because it had rather interesting plumage. And we started to discuss that, and in the end, it became apparent that it was rather unusual. I'd never seen a specimen like it before. So we started to discuss whether we might publish something about this. And at that time, I suggested, well, we could actually go back and start looking to see how many Calyptura specimens there really are in museums, because as I'll discuss in the talk, this had gone up over the years, more had come to light. Mm-hmm. And it transpired after we'd started to research this for a month or two that 2 colleagues of mine in Brazil were already on the tail of this. So we, I'm pleased to say, joined forces, and the result is what you will see this evening.
Great. Well, we're excited to see it. Lots of people are here, so thanks. We'll look forward to your talk. Go right ahead, take over the screen.
Okay. Is that working?
It is.
Okay, great. Okay, so as I mentioned, this talk is a result of not just my work, but also the work of Manuel Schweitzer in Switzerland, and 2 well-known Brazilian ornithologists, Robson Silva and Fernando Pacheco. And as I mentioned, Robson and Fernando had been already started to research how many specimens of Kinglet Calyptura there really were in museums, and we decided to join forces. Now, this talk was something that I originally put together for a European bird curators meeting last year, and I've changed it a little bit to make it a bit more of an accent on field sightings and other things. So it's not just specimens. I will talk about some of the general history of Calyptura as well. And as I mentioned, this thing came out of a couple of other strands of work. One was a monograph that I published about 10 years ago on cotingas and manakins. As you will see in this talk, Kinglet Calyptura is no longer either of those families, it's something else. And it also came about from a piece of work that Frank Lambert did. Frank Lambert went to Brazil in 2006 looking for Kinglet Calyptura. Needless to say, he didn't have any success, but we wrote up a short paper in Neotropical Birding about his experiences looking, and some of the thoughts we had about what the future held for this bird. So to start, this is the type description of Kinglet Calyptura, or as it was then known, Pardalotus cristatus. It was published by Viejo in 1818, and thereafter it was generally considered that Kinglet Calyptura was a cotinga, and indeed the smallest one of the family. Now, as you can see in this description here, all that they knew at that time was that it had been acquired by somebody called De La Lande, and it came from Brazil. In practice, the De La Lande was thought to have obtained the bird in the very environs of Rio de Janeiro. Now, there isn't any real hard evidence for that as far as I'm aware, and of course one can discuss exactly what the environs of Rio de Janeiro means, because of course Brazil being a huge country, it can be still fairly close to Rio and be 50 kilometers away or so. So anyway, the Calyptura was, up until the 2000s, regarded as a cotinga. It was often thought to be, latterly, to be part of a group of taxa called the Chiffornis assemblage, which includes things like Tityrus and Laniocera, the mourners, and Laniosoma, the shrike-like cotinga, or the elegant mourner. But most of all, principally due, of course, to its size, it was linked with Iodopleura purpletufts. And indeed, somebody did at one time suggest in the middle of the 20th century that perhaps Calyptura and the purpletufts could be considered a family apart from everything else, but that was an idea that never really caught on. So finally, as you can imagine, somebody eventually did some genetic sampling and worked out what it really was. And here's the Calyptura. It proves to be, most closely related to Neopipo, cinnamon Neopipo. It's also quite closely related to spadebills, the genus Platyrhynchus, and many-colored rush tyrant is also moderately close to it in the phylogenetic tree, but Tacurus, the rush tyrant, is not a member of the family genus, family arrangement, which has been suggested for these genera, which is Platyrhynchidae. That hasn't caught on very much yet. Most people still regard all these taxa as part of the Tyrannidae, the tyrant flycatchers. It's worth noting that David Snow, who published a monograph on the cotingas in the early 1980s, even at that time suggested that perhaps Calyptura was a primitive tyrannid. Certainly perceptive. It proves to be definitely a Tyrannidae, and with hindsight, it's not really that surprising. It is certainly the case that there is a resemblance to kinglets, the Northern Hemisphere genus Regulus, but it's nothing more than one of those things, a happenstance that these things look a little bit similar. They're not in any way closely related. So the fact that it looks a bit like golden crowned kinglet or ruby crowned kinglet or gold crest, if you're in Europe, it just isn't anything to do with those birds. So this is where the Kinglet Calyptura lives or lived. All of the records are from this very small area in southeast Brazil. All of the specimen records. And I would draw your attention to the fact that these are the definitely located specimens, which have rather precise date, reasonably precise data of their location. And they are all on the northern side of this mountain range, which is the Serra dos Argaus. And that is quite important for some of the changes that have happened in the landscape over the past couple of 100 years, which is something that I won't discuss perhaps now, but we could talk about in the Q&A afterwards as one of the reasons why perhaps this species has declined or maybe even gone extinct, although I tend to think it probably hasn't gone extinct yet, but we will see. Anyway, there are also a number of site records, all of them fairly recent, from this area in São Paulo state. It's worth saying that none of those are documented. There is a specimen which is labeled as being from São Paulo. It was collected in the first quarter of the 19th century by Frederick Sello and his companion Olfers during one of the first German expeditions to Brazil. There is some doubt and discussion and a degree of debate in the literature about where that specimen really comes from. It's certainly known that Sello also visited the Serra dos Argaus, so he could have taken it there. I mean, the specimen is labeled as being from São Paulo, but there's no unequivocal evidence that he definitely took it there. For example, there's no notebook or diary that also proclaims that fact, and there is certainly evidence that mislabeling occurred and things were relabeled and all this sort of thing. But anyway, irrespective of whether those records are correct or not in São Paulo, it is certainly the case that the range of this bird always was very small. And therefore there is, in theory, not a lot of ground to cover to re-find it. So there have been no specimens collected over the last at least 120, 30 years. As you will see a bit later on, it's probably longer than that, but certainly in the literature, it often mentions the end of the 19th century when the last one was collected. Until in 1996, this fine gentleman here, Ricardo Parini, rediscovered Kinglet Calyptura. And when I was thinking about this talk, I was kind of transported back in time to October 1996. As it happened, I was just about to go on a 3-month trip to Brazil in January of the next year, and suddenly the nascent internet was buzzing with the fact that Parini had rediscovered this bird, and it was seen by what could be really described as some of the creme de la creme of Brazilian ornithology at that time, and still are. One of the other people who saw the bird was Fernando Pacheco, the other guy flanking me in the photo, the bottom right. These two gentlemen were among the very privileged people who saw it. Indeed, I think Pacheco was the only person to see the bird through a telescope. Anyway, those heady days, unfortunately, very quickly came to an end. The birds weren't seen again. In January, for example, I and the colleagues I was with went to the Garrafal, which means big bottle. It's a fairly steep sloping, rather narrow valley below Teresópolis. And we looked fairly a little bit half-heartedly by then, because we knew that people had not seen it in the intervening period. And occasionally I know people still go there and look. Even at that time, it was something of a housing estate that was in the process of construction. So not a sort of area of absolutely primary forest, although there was fairly good forest all around it, but just it wasn't in the depths of really tall forest or anything. Anyway, as I mentioned, there are these other sightings in São Paulo, and it's interesting to go through them. Firstly, Thomas Sigrist claimed to have seen two Calyptura in a mixed species flock, which included some tanagers and other birds at a place called Pissinguaba near Ubatuba in July 1990. Now, he didn't report this for quite a number of years afterwards. Indeed, after even the birds had been seen in October 1996. I can't claim to be able to comment in detail about the sighting, but it's a bit strange to me that he waited so long to report it. I can understand why he might have been reticent in the first instance, in so much as if it would have seemed perhaps hard to believe, but as soon as the 1996 sighting cropped up, it was obviously the case that the bird was still around, and therefore would have been quite believable for somebody else to have said they'd seen it. But Sigrist actually didn't mention anything until about another 10 years later, which is a bit odd. But he did mention one thing, which was that one of the birds periodically raised its crest, which is interesting, but unfortunately he could have read that because that had been mentioned in the write-up of the Rediscovery by two of the observers of the 1996 birds. The 1997 record is very interesting. This was seen by a chap called Lad Hockey, who lives in Texas. And I actually, by total chance, went to see him because he was a friend of a friend. And I was in Texas in 2001. And the opportunity came about to go and see him. And therefore I did. And at that time, it was still the case that the description of the events in October 1996 had not been published. So he couldn't have seen them. And he too mentioned this crest raising. It's worth mentioning that Hockey is not really a birder. His wife is a birder. He saw the bird very briefly, but he gave quite a reasonable description for a non-birder. And as I say, he mentioned this crest raising, which to me was pretty telling, because as I say, the fact that that wasn't a well-known fact in the literature means that he couldn't have known about it. There are two other sightings, March 2006 and September 2008, both again close to Ubatuba, and two places which I'm sure lots and lots of people, including lots and lots of people watching this, I imagine, have been to. A place called the Folha Seca, which is well known as a place that lots of people go to watch hummingbirds, and Fazenda Angelim, which is a very good place, in fact, to see buff-throated purple-tuft. And both these sightings have some details about them. Schaefer's sighting is interesting, but I personally find it a little hard to believe. There are a few details that you would imagine that he would have seen, which he didn't mention. He also claimed to see another bird in the same flock, which doesn't occur in Ubatuba. That said, I wasn't standing beside him, so I don't know exactly what he saw. Giuliano Bernardon's description is also quite good. And again, it is plausible that he saw a Calyptura, but it does bear mention that both those places are birded a lot by the standards of Brazil, at least. I mean, maybe not for European or North American observers, would it quite match up to a lot, but by standards of Brazil, those places are visited a lot, and there have been no other sightings there. And it does bear mention that, in fact, the sighting in 2006, there were people there the very next day looking, and nobody saw anything. So the specimens, as I've already briefly alluded to, there are a lot of specimens, but a lot of specimens with very little information attached to them. And very, very few, even fewer of them are actually dated. Most of them have things like this written on them, which is just simply Brazil. Some of them are even vaguer than that, as we'll see. The ones that are dated are all from the late 1820s, and they're all collected near Novo Friburgo, which is in the Serra dos Orgãos. 1890 came to be mentioned as the date of the last specimen. Now, that was introduced by David Snow in Handbook of the Birds of the World, and I don't know where he got it from, and unfortunately, I never got the chance to ask him before he died. But I, to my chagrin, now repeated it in Catingas and Mannequins, to my chagrin, because I now know it to have been wrong. So, how many specimens are there? Up until recently, the general thought was it was somewhere in the region of 40 or 50. Back in 1982, David Snow actually said there's only a handful of them. But by the time that Nigel Collar was working on threatened birds of the Americas, he was able to track down some 45 specimens, mostly in European museums, but also in American Museum of Natural History in New York, and Academy of Natural Sciences, Philadelphia, and Smithsonian in Washington. So 45 started to be repeated a little bit. Then Snow mentioned that there was 50 based on the fact that Pacheco and Paulo Sergio Fonseca had mentioned this total in one of the papers describing the rediscovery in 1996. So this was repeated a little bit. When I started to work on the Catingas book, I found one or two more. For example, I found some in St. Petersburg, and one or two others had been mentioned in papers on for example, threatened birds harbored in museum collections. So McGee provided, for example, details on threatened birds in Manchester Museum, which includes a couple of Kinglet Calypturas. And then Human Walters, who are working on a book on extinct birds, found a couple more in relatively small museums in Florence and Kiel. However, there are a lot more. So as a result of the inventory that Pacheco and Hobson started, and then Manuel and myself came in and helped to work on, we have thus far found 105. It bears mention, perhaps, that up until quite recently, we thought it was 106. And we'd been waiting for photographs from one of a museum in Belgium, in Brussels, of the two specimens that they said they had. And we got those back in January this year, and in fact, one of them isn't a Kinglet Calyptura. It's a, I can't remember what it is now, but it's a very common tyrannid. Might be a beardless tyrannulet or something like that. I can't remember now, but or in the Lanier, I think. Anyway, there are 105, and we've either seen, I've seen about 50 of them, and we've seen photographs of, I think, just about all the rest. We also know of about another 11 specimens that are mentioned in the literature. Usually these are by people who had also seen other specimens, so we can have a degree of confidence that they really were Kinglet Calypturas, given what I've just mentioned. And therefore, we know that there was a lot of specimens. I mean, this is really pretty remarkable for a bird that's been lost for so long, and it's a small bird. This is really pretty amazing, and gives you some idea of how relatively numerous it must have been. And it also bears mention that there aren't really very many specimens collected by one person. Not even, for example, somebody collected a lot of them. No one person did collect a lot of them. I think the maximum is probably about 2 or 3. It's really quite small. So this gives you some idea that it really must have been quite common and quite easy to collect. But it is very annoying that there are so few specimens which have got very good locality data. There are lots of specimens which have come from dealers and through what might be termed assemblers of collections, i.e. people who are interested in putting together representative collections of birds of the world, who weren't necessarily that interested in the locality data behind what they were putting together. They were interested in having something that was impressive, but they weren't necessarily interested in the science, if you like. So exciting to find so many specimens, but at the same time rather frustrating that so few of them have really good data attached to them. I would remark that given that there have been specimens found in quite small museums, that there could still be others to find, and given that there have been misidentifications in both directions, I might add, that if you have access to a small collection, don't imagine that you couldn't plausibly find one of these in there if it's an old enough collection and had a benefactor, for example, who assembled a large amount of material, some of which might have gone to other museums. For example, there is a specimen in Trieste which we have some quite good data on, and I'll show you that a little bit later. But it was actually deposited there en route to Vienna, and most of the specimens from the relevant collection were destined for Vienna and went to Vienna, but they deposited a few in Trieste, and it includes a Kinglet Calyptura. So, as I mentioned, there are very few with locality information, and the ones that are reasonably specific, they're all in a very tight, well circumscribed area, which, as I showed you earlier, is on the north side of the Serra dos Orgãos. And this area was a very well collected area back in the first half of the 19th century. So there was a whole bunch of people who went there. You've got Danes, you've got Frenchmen, you've got Germans, you've got English, you've got the whole gamut of colonials turning up there and collecting. The well-labeled specimens, most of them are from Lund and are in Copenhagen. These are two of those specimens here. They even have information on stomach contents, which is something rather unique. The only other person that provides any information on diet was de Cortiz, who provided the only real contemporary natural history information about this bird, some of which might be slightly fanciful, but I suspect most of it is the best we've got to go on ultimately. As you can also see, there's a whole ton of specimens which have highly dubious and erroneous locality information. So you even have Mexico, Bogota, Guyana, and so on. Quite a few are labeled New Holland, and then there's a lot which are labeled Brazil or Southeast Brazil or Rio de Janeiro. The latter shouldn't, of course, necessarily be taken to mean actually the city of Rio de Janeiro. They probably just mean somewhere in the environs, and Teresópolis, Serra dos Órgãos in this context can be taken to be Rio de Janeiro. So what can we find out? Well, we were able to, through a little bit of sleuthing, find some things out which add to the store of knowledge. So, for example, the specimen on the left, which is a specimen in Halle, was collected by Burmeister, or he got it from a guy called Beske, another German. It was almost certainly taken around Novo Friburgo. Indeed, this is the label on the stand of the specimen. It mentions Nov Frib, which I'm sure is shorthand for Novo Friburgo. And given the dates that Burmeister was active, we can date it to sometime between 1850 and 1852. This specimen, which is the Trieste specimen, which I mentioned, we can also provide some dating information on. It's certainly from August 1857. We know that from the expedition, the general information about the expedition. Unfortunately, we don't have any diary from the person who collected it. We don't even know who collected it. We just know that it comes from this Novara expedition. But we can at least date it from the general knowledge and information about that expedition. And we've been able to do that with a few specimens, many fewer than we'd like, but at least it is something. The one thing that we can say is that it's pretty clear that there are no specimens that we can definitely say were collected much later than about 1860. There are certainly specimens in museums which were accessioned later than this, much later, even later than the 1890 date that Snow gave. But the ones that we can actually find some real history about, we can be sure were collected much earlier than this. They came via people who maintained private collections and donated them to public institutions on their death. And we know in these cases that the time that they would have been collected is much earlier than when they were accessioned. So the accession date gives us nothing but a bum steer, in fact, as to when they were collected. Now, it is plausible, of course, that some could date from later than 1860, but there isn't really any strong indication of that. that we can definitely find. So we assembled information on all the specimens that we could. We logged all the information that you might expect. We assembled locality information, any information on sex that was provided by the collector. We were interested in who the specimens came from, irrespective of whether that was the collector or not, because in some cases that can be useful. In these instances, it often wasn't, because a lot of them were dealers, but in some cases it did provide moderate clues. So, for example, there was a specimen that came to, I think it was AM&H, and it had come from George Lawrence, and we were actually able to track the fact that it had some label information which had the name of the person who'd actually taxidermied the specimen, and we could find out some information about him, which provided at least the date as to when it was originally mounted, which again proved that it had been collected a lot earlier than it might have been suggested by the time it was accessioned into a museum. So we assembled as much information as we can. It doesn't necessarily tell us that much in a lot of respects, but at least it does narrow down the angles that one can investigate. For example, you might be able to see here, these were accessioned in the late 1870s. But Schneider, for example, from whom the first one came, he was a dealer and a taxidermist, so it doesn't provide a lot of clues, and he sent material all over the place, and not necessarily at a time shortly after material was collected. So that date is a not necessarily a real clue as to its collection date. So what about plumage variation? During the time that I was doing the monograph, there were suggestions around that females might differ from males by being generally duller. The head pattern is not as striking. The patch on the crown is more restricted. There's narrower white tips to the wing, some of the wing feathers. The rump patch is paler, etc. I tend to think that we can't be really very sure about any of this stuff. There's a lot of variation. I mean, you can see in these specimens from Berlin that you have one here that's got a strikingly brilliant red crown, and then you've got another one where you can hardly see it. But this has also got a pretty large and extensive and very yellow rump patch. This one doesn't really seem to have very much of a rump patch at all. This one isn't very well developed either. So to be honest, I would, if I was rewriting the book now, I'd probably tear all of that up and throw it away, really. I really don't know that we can be too deterministic about any of this at all. And it bears mention that, at least in terms of the head pattern, quite a lot will depend on the way the specimen has been prepared. So, for example, the difference between this one and that one might really not be very much in all truth. But there, as you can see, there's a lot of variation in crown colour. this isn't necessarily the brightest one, although it is pretty bright. This is the only specimen in Brazil, in fact, in Museu Nacional. This is the specimen that Manuel found in Bern. And then you've got another one with a very yellow patch. And another one, this one's in Helsinki, which is more orange than red. It's certainly the case that some of these birds could have faded in sunlight. Birds are often mounted for public exhibition, in which case they will become exposed to sunlight, sometimes direct, and the crown patch will fade as a result, or indeed the general plumage will fade as a result. But there are instances of specimens that have got really strikingly red crowns, and we know they've been exposed to sunlight. They've been on public exhibition. For example, the Haller specimen, which I showed a bit earlier, which has got a pretty strikingly red crown, was on public exhibit for a long time. So this doesn't always hold up. So at this point in time, I'm not really very convinced that we can say an awful lot about plumage variation. One thing I would say is that we know a little bit about plumage maturation in Platyrhynchus in the spadebills, which we now know this bird to be a relatively close relative of. Plausibly, it could be the case that some of the information for spadebills could be analogous to Calyptura, but I would be not confident of that without more to base it upon. There are a few possible avenues for investigating this further, but they would involve quite time-consuming techniques and involve more expertise than I would certainly be able to throw at this. But potentially this is something that could be researched more in the future. So there's a lot of acknowledgements, but the thing I would like to leave on is this amazing illustration by de Courtils of a kinglet Calyptura being massacred by a tarantula. As I mentioned, de Courtils was our only source of original natural history information that is contemporaneous. And he told us that it fed on fruits and insects, and that it lived in second growth, that it could generally be found in the same place year round, and that it had a note, it had a call a bit like a house sparrow. Sounds quite remarkable, but there you go. And it was apparently a fairly easy bird to observe, none of which rings very true now. One thing he did also say, which we can safely say is for the birds, was that it occurs throughout Brazil. And now that you might think, well, that would kind of invalidate everything else he said, but I don't think we should be so harsh and judge him with the standards of today for 170 years ago. His account is useful and interesting, but it certainly provides a difficult thing to get your head around today, because you'd think if it was still living in second growth, we wouldn't really have any trouble finding it. But we certainly do have trouble finding it, and rather a lot of trouble. So that is something that is very hard to grapple with. And to be honest, I'm probably as mystified as everyone watching this about how we put together that historical experience with what our experience is now. But that is all we have to go on. And I think that I could leave it there, and then we could go for questions and answers, Laura, maybe. Laura, I think you're muted.
Okay. I was saying that it's when it comes to these rare species, we so desperately want to bring them to life. You know, in addition to obviously seeing them in the field, we want to examine every clue that we can find to kind of reconstruct its life history. And I was wondering what, other than finding it in the field, is there any other avenue of research onto this species that you think is a next step? I think you're muted.
That's a good question. And I honestly am a little doubtful that there is. Short of some really massive effort to genetically sequence a lot of specimens to try and analyze whether this thing has gone through some evolutionary bottleneck or something akin to this, I really don't know that there is much more to be gained, unless, of course, somebody finds us, well, a few specimens which have got a whole load of new data which we can have faith in and show something new. I really don't know that that this is an avenue that can be taken a lot further. Actually, it is rather disheartening to say that, but I think that given the number of people who have over the years gone back to the specimen record, for example, I mentioned that Nigel Collar had found quite a lot of specimens when he and his colleagues were working on threatened birds of the Americas. Well, Nigel is certainly no slouch when it comes to researching the historical record. So I wouldn't want to say it's impossible, but it does feel like something that really does require finding it in the field and finding it consistently to break this stranglehold.
Challenge accepted, right? In fact, I think it would be great for the audience if you have ever searched for this bird. Let us know in the chat. I'd be interested in reading that later, and let us know how it went or if you plan to go again. A couple other questions here. So you said you found about 105 different specimens, and at one point you said it suggests that they were common and easy to collect. Based on this knowledge, would you venture to guess maybe how large that population was compared to other specimen numbers that you have experience with in that region?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I would like to put a total on how many specimens or how big the population was back in, let's say, the mid 1800s, but certainly for a bird that is now known to be very rare and possibly on the brink of extinction, this is a lot of specimens, a real lot of specimens. I mean, you could single out some other rare birds where there is nothing like this number of specimens. For example, another bird from exactly the same area, Tijuca condita, the grey-winged cotinga, which was only discovered in start of the 1980s, and it was then seen in the field in the mid 1980s, and it occurs at the top of the Serra do Sogal, so you have to climb quite high to get to it. There is only like a couple of specimens of that. So, and nowadays, you know, if you want to see that bird, it's easy. You can drive up to it now. Actually, I mean, it's been found in another place, and anybody who wants to see it, I mean, it's literally all you've got to do is go to the place. Really, I mean, okay, you might have to go for 2 days rather than one or something, but you know, you'll just see it if you go to the right place, pretty much.
Mhm.
Of course, you know, bird watching isn't train spotting, so it's not totally guaranteed, but you've got a very, very, very good chance. And yet, this bird is lost, and there's 100 and something specimens. I mean, it's a real big difference. And I could name other examples where, I mean, for example, Spix's macaw is known from rather few specimens, and they're all birds that are in captivity pretty much, apart from a couple. And the number of birds that were ever seen by ornithologists is like fewer than 10. And it was discovered around about the same time as Kinglet Calyptura.
Hmm.
So there's a huge difference. And of course, the Spix's macaw lives in a very remote part of Brazil. So it's a different equation, but it's still, this is really remarkable that there is a bird that is ostensibly so rare, which was collected in such large numbers. And if you remember, going back to something I mentioned, it wasn't just like a few people collected a lot. There is a lot of different people collected it.
Do we understand any of the pressures that led to the species disappearance or near disappearance?
Well, okay. So this, I mean, this is an interesting thing, and it came out of the research that mainly that Frank Lambert did, which I collaborated with him on, which was, if you remember, all of the definite localities are all on the north side of the mountain range, and it is unquestionably the case that that area of the mountains and the the hinterland running to the border with Minas Gerais has been altered a lot. So you have in about the 1790s, that area started to be colonized by people who were growing coffee, and they started to change the landscape. And that accelerated in the 1820s and 1830s. And a bit later, you have those forests being cut down for use in both construction and literally fuel on railroads.
Mhm.
And most of the forest that is left north of the actual Serra itself is second growth, and some of it is probably quite recent second growth, like 50, 60, 70 years old or something like this. And it is much less rich in epiphytes. It's much drier than it probably originally was. It has many, many, many fewer large trees. If you go back to old accounts of what that area was like in the first part of the 19th century, people talking about riding along on horseback through forest, which was 30, 40 meters tall. That sort of stuff just does not exist now. It's nothing like that. And it, as I say, possibly really importantly, that the actual type of forest is different. It's drier, it's much less rich in epiphytes. This thing, if it is anything like, for example, purple tufts, it could be a mistletoe specialist. I mean, obviously, the comparison with with purple tufts is partly born out of size, because they're both of a similar uh, size, but uh, purple tufts, for example, are known to fly catch quite regularly. So they'll fly up from a position on the top of a tree or a quite exposed branch and catch airborne insects. Now, there's no indication, for example, from what the people saw in 1996 or from the contemporary account that Calyptura does that, but it would probably feed on similar sized fruits. So that comparison at least is useful. So yeah, there's real definite evidence that the habitat within the range that we can be sure about has changed and changed irrevocably. But I would still go back to the one thing, which is this account of it being in second growth, which would to some extent say, well, okay, how much does that change really matter? I suppose it could matter if the thing really was, if the microclimate was the important thing, then it would still matter. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of unknowns there. I mean, it's basically it's like looking for a pin in right. 3 haystacks, not one.
Right, a lot of conjectures involved.
Yeah.
So let's see, we've got a question here. Do any of the recent reports, such as the 1996 sightings, have any photo or audio documentation? And do we understand why not, if there isn't any?
Well, okay. The answer is no. None of them do. Including the 1996 one. Now, the 1996 observation was by multiple people. As I mentioned, it was made by really top class people. I mean, the people who saw it are in the main were really top people. The guy who rediscovered it, Pahini, is a true legend. To go in the field with this man is just humbling and despairing in equal measure.
I love people like that.
He's a true rock star of birding, but as far away from a rock star as you could imagine, because he's too humble to make anything of it. But I mean, nobody knows that region of Brazil like he does, and knows. I mean, he's a fantastic expert on foraging behavior and diet of birds. I mean, you know, you're in the field with him and you're watching something, and he's seeing the way that a bird feeds, and you just sort of think, God, what, you know, why am I bothering to be here? Almost, you know, it's like that. So I mean, there's no documentation, but I don't think that there's any real reason to doubt that there were a good number of people there. As I mentioned, Pacheco, who is certainly not a slouch, even in comparison to Pahini, is an extremely knowledgeable birder and ornithologist, and as I mentioned, he did see it through the telescope. So I don't think there's any reason to doubt that, but there isn't documentation for it. And the answer to the sub question is why not? Is that at that time, you know, it's not like today. There weren't any. You know, not everybody had digital cameras. I mean, people hardly had cameras at all, really. It is worth mentioning that they did have tape recorders, though, and they had their tape recorders switched on when they saw the birds, but they didn't pick up anything that they could be certain was from the Calypturas. And it's certainly worth emphasizing that these people know the bird sounds of that region intimately. So if they'd heard something that was different, it would have leapt out at them.
Absolutely. Okay. We're at 1:02. I want to ask one more question. I hate to cut short conversation when it's good. I know that there's a lot of people who can stick with us just a little bit more. So some people are commenting about the degree of red and yellow on the crest. Could it be affected by diet, like in the house finch? And somebody said fading with regard to direct light would be very dependent on where the sun was relative to the window and the distance from the glass and time. So you want to comment on that at all?
Well, I mean, that comment is perfectly correct, and that's obviously true. And of course, it is difficult to provide a complete history of exactly how a specimen, how a specimen's spatial history, if you like. So investigating things like that would be rather difficult. But the comment is, absolutely fair and true. The issue about the distribution of the different colours in the crown. I don't know how. Sorry, about the influence of diet on the crown colour. I'd be a bit surprised about that, in so much as I would imagine that influence of diet would have a more general effect on plumage color, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
Okay.
The problem is, of course, is that our knowledge of the diet is so limited that trying to link the two would be really difficult. I mean, Decourtils did provide he did provide the name of at least one of the plants which he said the bird fed on. Rather interestingly, it proves to be a plant that, comparatively speaking, not that many birds feed on it. Although there are data which indicate that at least a few fruit-eating birds do use it, but not as commonly as some other things, like melastomes and such like, which loads of birds feed on.
Okay, I'm going to leave you with this thought. You said in your talk that you would be surprised if it was completely extinct. So I want you to think, if you could organize the perfect expedition to go do the final search for that bird, what would that expedition look like? Where would you go and who would you take with you?
Well,
anyone living or dead?
Right, okay. Perhaps not in the spirit of the question, the way the questioner intended it, but I would say that what you need is actually to mobilize every Brazilian birder that could be mustered for the exercise, because it's plain that looking just a few people hasn't worked. I mean, it's worth mentioning that some good people have looked. Frank Lambert spent 2 months looking in 2006. Derek Scott and Mike Brook looked in the 1980s when they found the grey-winged cotinga in the field. They were looking for this bird. And several Brazilian people, Luciano Lima has looked for it, and such like. So there's been effort. But as I say, I think it would require a fairly big mobilization and people looking in every place that one could, at least within the confines of the Serra do Gauge. Personally, I know that several Brazilian people are rather doubtful that it was ever recorded in São Paulo. Personally, I think it's worth a look there. I mean, I think that people should be mindful that there are claims from there, and at least some of the claims have a degree of legitimacy. So we should be mindful of that, and we should keep that prospect in mind. So
I see a great Brazilian bird count in the future.
yeah. I mean, 500 Brazilians looking for Christmas bird count. There's a start for it.
So I wonder, because I don't know the region, how many people live around there, and how accessible is it to the average birder?
Okay, well, it's very accessible to the basic area is very accessible to the average birder, in so much as it's kind of to get to Teresópolis, for example, which is where the 1996 record was, is at most about an hour from Galeão, the Rio's international airport. So it's close. needless to say, there are quite a lot of birders living in that region. Needless to say, I'm sure all of them have in the back of the mind, well, you know, maybe today will be the day. I'm sure not very many of them go out with a real prospect of that. But I'm sure they all have it in the back of their mind that maybe one day this will, such rewards will come to them. So yeah, I mean, it's an accessible area, but it is also the case that there are areas of forest within the Serra do Gauge which are very difficult to get to. So it isn't the case that, yes, it's just although there's a national park there, the area of the national park that you can access is moderately small. But you can walk up a very full elevational gradient within the national park.
Mhm.
You can go from high elevation to fairly low elevation. And for example, Frank Lambert, when he went looking, he spent time in Regoa, which is a reserve created in the real lowlands of the Serra do Gauge, which is also very accessible from Rio. It's a really nice place to go. And I don't think in the low elevations, which are really well covered, needless to say, there are people going there all the time and staying there, and there are good local guides there. So I'm sure that probably it's not going to be found there in the easily accessible parts of that reserve. But who knows about the less accessible parts? It could be lurking there. So the answer is a bit of yes and a bit of no. There is easy access to the general area. For example, the other side of the mountains, where the specimens come from, is also perfectly well accessible. It's a bit further from Rio, but it's 2 hours rather than an hour. It's not a huge distance. So quite accessible, but there are parts which will be difficult to get to.
What other species could it potentially be mistaken for? Like, for example, not only in the field, but in your specimens, what did you see? Like,
well, there were, well, as I mentioned to you, there's certainly one specimen that was still labeled until recently, perhaps still is labeled as being a Calyptura, which I think, if I remember rightly, it was an Elania. Which has also got wing bars, but hasn't got a red or even orange-red crown. So, I mean, I don't know who made that mistake. I mean, realistically, this bird is very distinctive. It really does look like an old or a northern hemisphere regulus, a crest. So, I mean, I don't think it's not easily confused, but it's a small bird, and it's worth mentioning that the certainly in 1996, it was at mid-height or in the canopy of not really tall trees, but it was in the canopy of trees. So it's not necessarily going to be easy to see one, and we don't know the voice, so you can't just roll up and turn a recording on.
Yeah, so Van Remsen asks, what did Perini say about the foraging behavior and height above ground? So you seem to just answer that. Mid-height to canopy, has that been repeated by other observers?
Well, all of the site records were all either canopy or mid-height. Decotil said that it was in second, well, what Brazilians would call capoeira, which is like second growth, sort of really rubbishy type forest, sort of old banana plantations or something one could almost imagine in it, or something overgrown cultivation like that almost it could be in. But all of the site records suggest mid-height to canopy. Decotil said mid-height or lower.
Okay. So we don't know. We're
trying.
trying.
I mean the fact that all these, I mean, one thing I think you can be sure of is that we wouldn't have all these specimens if they'd all been in the canopy of trees, because these people were collecting them with guns. They weren't collecting them with mist nets.
Yeah, good point. What is there any ongoing effort to save the current habitat, or is it like, what is the land ownership of that area right now?
Okay, well, there's quite a lot of, there's, as I mentioned, there's a national park, which is probably got a reasonable level of protection. It's a well-established old national park. There are several private reserves, which in general, provided they're reasonably well funded, is probably better protection than a state protected area, as I'm sure you can imagine. The bottom line is that recent deforestation is probably not really very much of an issue now in this area. You know, there's a reasonable degree of consciousness that chopping everything down is no longer the thing to do. So I would say that what we have now isn't likely to change very much. The real issue is the one that we've already discussed, which is how some of that forest has changed in its microclimate and its composition of what's actually in the forest. Mm-hmm. Type of trees and the epiphytes and such like.
Somebody asked if there is a loss of habitat and food source in the original area, could this species have moved on, migrated to a more hospitable area?
Well, it's obviously not impossible to some extent, although you know, most forest birds aren't very good at moving long distances. It has been postulated in the past that Calyptura was an elevational migrant. I don't think that was really based on anything. I suspect it, in part that idea was mooted simply to try and explain why people weren't seeing it. The same thing was mooted for purple tuft, the buff-throated purple tuft, which in fact certainly at one time occurred in the same place where the Calyptura was found, in the Garofal. However, the evidence for Iodopleura being an elevational migrant is also pretty weak, in all truth. Not quite an urban myth, but something of one to a degree. So, I mean, plausibly, yes, but it would only be able to move into an adjacent forested area. It wouldn't be able to move a really long distance.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, Guy, this has been really great. I really appreciate your time here today. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you for all your questions. I'm sorry if I didn't get to yours today. Feel free to reach out to us at the Birds of the World contact form if you have anything really urgent that you'd like us to follow up on. And if Jessica could put the link to the feedback form in the chat, that would be wonderful. Maybe you've already done that. Any parting thoughts, Guy?
Thank you for watching. How about that? That's a parting.
That's perfect. All right. Thank you so much. Take care. So, Guy, I typically stay on and read some of the comments, and probably people slowly get off. We probably have about 100 people on, and but I really appreciate the time you put into this. This is great. So much.